Normandy, July 1944. A hedgerow east of St. Lo. A German paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division is folded into the base of the embankment wearing a smock cut from waterproof cotton in a disruptive pattern the Waffen-SS had field-tested in 1937, and the German High Command had estimated would cut casualties by 15%. His helmet is covered. His face is darkened. The vegetation around him is undisturbed. He has held this position without moving for nearly 6 hours in the specific discipline that German camouflage training drilled into every soldier issued the pattern. Stillness is the camouflage. Movement, more than any flaw in the printed fabric itself, is what the human eye and the trained observer's attention actually catch. He has done everything the German army trained him to do. No patrol walks the lane in front of him. No scout points toward his position. No spotter calls out a sighting, and then without any of the preconditions that should precede a man's death in combat, an 81mm mortar round detonates 10 ft above him, then a second, then a third. His squad mate, captured shortly after and questioned by 1st Army intelligence officers, says something that recurs in different phrasing across dozens of interrogation reports filed that summer. "We were not seen. It is a strange complaint from a prisoner of war." He is not claiming the Americans missed. He is claiming they found him without finding him, that his concealment had functioned exactly as designed, and he was dead regardless. 6 weeks earlier, the identical camouflage system designed by the same Munich art professor had been killing British infantry at a catastrophic rate east of Caen. British, Canadian, and Polish casualties in Normandy reached 83,000 by the end of August, 16,000 of them fatal. Much of it inflicted by weapons fired from positions the attacker never located. The camouflage worked. The Germans were ghosts in the hedgerows, and the British paid for it in blood. So why did the same ghosts, fighting the same way in the same terrain, stop being ghosts against a different army? The answer has nothing to do with sharper American eyes, better trained scouts, or superior camouflage doctrine. The Americans barely had one, and what little doctrine existed was abandoned within weeks for reasons that had nothing to do with its tactical merit. It has to do with a theory of warfare developed 2 decades earlier at a desert artillery school in Oklahoma, built around a question nobody else in 1944 had seriously asked. What if you didn't need to see the enemy at all? The camouflage itself deserves to be taken seriously because it is the easiest part of the story to underestimate. In 1931, the German Reichswehr issued a 4-color disruptive pattern called splitter tarn. Hard-edged green and brown polygons over a tan or gray field with vertical green dashes suggesting rain. It was designed originally for the Zeltbahn, the triangular shelter quarter every German soldier carried, and was gradually adapted into smocks, helmet covers, and Luftwaffe jump uniforms through the late 1930s. The pattern's geometric construction reflected the limits of contemporary textile printing technology as much as any design philosophy. Hard polygon edges were simpler and cheaper to mass-produce accurately than the organic shapes that would come later, and splitter tarn was, by the standards of its successors, a workable but unsophisticated solution. The more sophisticated development came from the SS reconnaissance establishment. SS Major Wim Brandt, an engineer commanding the SS Reconnaissance Battalion, went looking in 1935 for better concealment and found Johann Georg Otto Schick, a Munich art professor who had spent years studying how light moves through tree canopy across the seasons. Schick's academic background was in textile and pattern design rather than military science, which made him, in the context of 1930s European camouflage research, something of an outsider whose contribution depended entirely on persuading skeptical military engineers that artistic technique had something concrete to offer for combat survival. Schick understood something specific about human vision. The eye locks onto sharp edges and consistent shapes, in a pattern that has neither breaks down as a recognizable object. He designed patterns unlike anything previously deployed on a battlefield. Eichenlaubmuster, oak leaf, Platanmuster, plane tree, Rauchtarnmuster, blurred smoke edge. Painted not as geometric shapes, but as an approximation of dappled light itself. He made the garments reversible, green on one side for summer, brown on the other for autumn, doubling the system's seasonal effectiveness with no added manufacturing complexity. The SS Deutschland Regiment ran field trials in 1937. The estimate that came back projected a 15% reduction in casualties, a figure derived from controlled exercises comparing detection rates between soldiers wearing the new patterns and soldiers in standard field gray, observed by trained spotters at varying ranges and under varying light conditions. Patents were filed in 1938. By the time German paratroopers landed in Crete in 1941, the Wehrmacht's elite formations had access to what was, by any honest technical measure, the most advanced individual soldier camouflage system on Earth. A system that would not see meaningful imitation by other major armies until well after the war's end. Picture what this looked like in practice in Normandy in June 1944. A Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadier from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, settles into a hedgerow north of Caen, wearing Schick's oak leaf pattern, green side out. Around him, 6 earthen banks topped with brambles and hawthorn that had grown undisturbed since the Roman occupation. The sunken lanes were so deep and so overgrown that a Scottish reconnaissance officer, writing afterward of the fighting, described seeing or suspecting danger in every blade of grass. The German soldier has dug into the bank itself beneath the root system in a position tunneled through the embankment, so he can fire from either side without repositioning. A degree of engineering effort that German pioneer units had clearly invested significant time preparing well before any British advance reached the position, suggesting defensive planning that anticipated the bocage's tactical value months in advance, rather than improvising it under pressure. The Imperial War Museum's own account of the fighting describes British infantry advancing against what it calls, without qualification, an almost invisible enemy. The British paid for that invisibility in a currency measured precisely. 24,698 casualties by June 30th, more than 46,000 by July 25th. Mortar fire delivered from German tubes positioned 3,000 to 4,000 Normandy behind the front line, directed by observers the British infantry never located, accounted for roughly 3/4 of those losses. The system was elegant in its economy, a thin screen of camouflage forward positions on every hedgerow crest, existing not to win the firefight, but to identify where the British were, feeding coordinates back to mortar and rocket batteries that did the actual killing from a distance no rifleman could reach. No Allied camouflage program of the period came close to matching what Schick's research had produced. British and Canadian forces in Normandy fought largely in plain khaki battle dress with only scattered unofficial use of improvised foliage and sniper-specific Denison smocks, while German infantry across multiple divisions wore standardized mass-produced patterns, purpose-built for the specific terrain they were defending. The reason this asymmetry receives relatively little popular attention is straightforward. The historical record tends to be written by the side that ultimately wins the larger war, and the larger war was won by an army fighting a different kind of fight in a different sector at the same time. Within the specific British versus German contest in the bocage, judged purely on its own terms, the Germans were winning decisively and repeatedly for the better part of 2 months. The British army that suffered this was not undertrained or undermotivated. It contained veterans of North Africa, Italy, and Crete, fighting under Lieutenant General Guy-Simon's bite-and-hold doctrine, a careful set-piece method built on a rolling artillery barrage followed by infantry advancing in disciplined fire, and movement against a positively identified objective. The doctrine had been refined through 3 years of hard experience against German positions in the desert, where flat open terrain had made it broadly effective. In the Western Desert, German positions could often be located by aerial reconnaissance and direct observation well before contact, and the rolling barrage could be timed against confirmed coordinates with reasonable confidence. The bocage destroyed that confidence systematically. Normandy's hedgerows were not open desert. Each field, typically 40 to 200 yards across, was bounded by an earthen bank topped with dense vegetation that had grown for centuries, creating a terrain feature closer to a maze of fortified compartments than open countryside. British officers who had fought at El Alamein found themselves applying a doctrine calibrated for visibility ranges of a mile or more to terrain where visibility might be 15 yards in any direction. The doctrine's core assumption, that aerial and ground reconnaissance could reliably locate the enemy before an attack began, simply did not transfer. That sequence had one absolute requirement regardless of terrain. You had to see the target before you could engage it. A British rifle section, 8 to 10 men, a single Bren gun, the rest carrying bolt-action Lee Enfields capable of perhaps 15 aim rounds per minute in skilled hands. operated on the assumption that an attack meant closing on a position you had confirmed, suppressing what you found there, and killing visible men. The Imperial War Museum's own historians have acknowledged that British formations sometimes exhibited more caution than the tactical situation warranted, and that troops were frequently willing to go to ground and call for artillery support even against limited opposition. Max Hastings, in his history of the campaign, put it more bluntly. The Allies and the British specifically fought a cautious, methodical war, while the Germans fought fast and aggressively and were extraordinarily good at it. Hastings' point was not that British soldiers performed poorly. It was that German soldiers performed brilliantly in precisely the kind of engagement the British doctrine offered them. An engagement in which the man who could not be seen was the man who survived to kill. A Scottish veteran of the fighting along the Odin River, quoted in post-war studies of British infantry tactics, recalled the specific texture of this asymmetry. If a soldier appeared, everyone fired at him. Everyone. The phrase reveals how rarely it happened. The German rifleman, hooded beneath his chic design smock, fired once from concealment and then did not fire again until he had relocated. A British section that took a single casualty from an unseen position did exactly what its training specified. It went to ground and radioed for support, and while it waited, the German mortar crews to the rear, already supplied with coordinates by the forward observer who had watched the British line approach, opened fire on a target that had obligingly stopped moving. Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, is the single engagement most often cited to illustrate this dynamic, and the specifics deserve more attention than the engagement usually receives. The British 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, veterans of 3 years of mobile warfare in North Africa, where exactly this kind of methodical advance had repeatedly proven effective, pushed a reconnaissance column through the town in an attempt to outflank the German defenses around Caen. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger tank that had become separated from its unit, identified the column from a concealed position along the road and attacked alone. In the space of roughly 15 minutes, Wittmann's tank destroyed or disabled more than a dozen British vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, and reconnaissance cars strung out along the narrow main street with no room to maneuver or return effective fire. The Tiger's heavy frontal armor made it functionally immune to the British vehicle's main guns at the ranges involved. What makes Villers-Bocage relevant to the broader pattern is not Wittmann's tactical brilliance, considerable as it was, but the structural reason the column was vulnerable to it in the first place. The 7th Armored's advance had proceeded according to a doctrine built for terrain where an approaching column could reasonably expect early warning, visual contact with enemy armor at distances measured in hundreds or thousands of yards, time to deploy into a fighting formation before contact. The Bocage offered none of that warning. A single well-concealed tank applying exactly the same camouflage principles that protected German infantry in the hedgerows could engage a road-bound column from point-blank range before anyone in that column had any indication a threat existed. The mechanism that made Schick's camouflage devastating against infantry was in this instance scaled up to 60 tons of armored vehicle, with results that British armored doctrine had no immediate answer for. The mechanism that made this work at Villers-Bocage in mid-June, when SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann's single Tiger tank destroyed a substantial portion of the British 7th Armored Division's lead column in minutes, was the same mechanism operating at platoon scale across the entire Bocage. Nothing in the advancing British formation located the threat until the threat's first round was already in flight. What neither army on either side of that engagement yet understood was that an entirely different theory of target acquisition was about to arrive in the same terrain. The American rifle section and the American doctrine above it at every level did not treat seeing the enemy as a precondition for killing him. 20 years before D-Day, the relevant thinking was happening not in France, but at Fort Benning, Georgia, and Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Institutions operating on the threadbare budgets of the interwar army, working through a problem more fundamental than any specific tactic. The interwar army that produced this thinking was by any measure a marginal institution within American national life. Ranked 17th in the world by size in 1939, smaller than the Army of Romania, chronically underfunded through a depression that saw most government spending categories cut to the bone, the U.S. Army of the 1920s and 1930s had little institutional prestige and even less political support. What it had in specific pockets was a culture of taking seriously the lessons of the previous war, at a moment when most of the world's major militaries were more interested in refighting their last victory than in interrogating their own casualty statistics. American infantry doctrine through the 1920s and 1930s had absorbed a specific lesson from the Army's own studies of First World War small arms engagement. In modern combat, the enemy is mostly invisible. He's in a trench, a hedge, a building. The Napoleonic image of two ranks exchanging aimed fire at visible silhouettes had no relationship to what actually happened on a real battlefield where most infantry fire on both sides was directed at suspected rather than confirmed positions, and the rounds that did the killing were simply the ones that happened to land where an enemy actually was. This was not a uniquely American observation. French and German staff studies of the same war reached broadly similar conclusions, but the American institutional response to the observation diverged sharply from what either European power chose to build. Two decisions followed from this insight, and together they determined the character of the war the American riflemen would fight in 1944. The first was the M1 Garand, adopted as the standard infantry rifle in 1936, the only semi-automatic standard-issue infantry rifle fielded by any major combatant in the entire war. The decision to adopt it had been contested for years within the Army's own ordnance bureaucracy, with traditionalists arguing that a semi-automatic rifle would waste ammunition and erode the fire discipline that bolt-action weapons enforced by their slower cycle. The argument that won was precisely the opposite. That volume of fire against suspected positions was more valuable than disciplined, conserved fire against confirmed ones, and that an army prepared to spend ammunition liberally needed a rifle that could deliver it. A trained American rifleman could fire roughly 24 aim rounds per minute. A trained British rifleman with a Lee Enfield 15, the German carabiner 98K's practical rate was lower still. Canted to the squad, the difference became structural rather than incremental. A 12-man American rifle squad with one Browning automatic rifle and 11 Garands could put roughly 300 rounds downrange in a minute against perhaps a 150 to 180 from a comparable British section. That volume meant the American squad could afford to fire at a location it merely suspected rather than one it had positively confirmed without sacrificing the ability to move and observe at the same time. The second decision was doctrinal, and the Army gave it a clinical name: reconnaissance by fire. Field manuals of the period instructed units to fire on likely enemy positions, specifically to provoke a response that would confirm the enemy's presence and location. In Normandy, this produced a specific and repeatable procedure. American armored columns trained their main guns and machine guns alternately left and right of their axis of advance, firing more or less continuously into any terrain that might conceal a position. Tank infantry teams approaching a hedgerow combed the foliage with machine gun fire before any infantryman stepped through the gap. Supply trucks running partially cleared roads mounted 50 caliber Brownings on their cabs and used them the same way. The Army's own post-war analysis stated the principle without euphemism. When tanks lead an attack, they must use their guns for reconnaissance by fire, and approaches to hedgerows should be combed with machine gun fire. As a matter of course, independent of whether a specific threat had been identified, consider what this meant from inside the German position. A paratrooper wearing 6 most sophisticated pattern dug into a hedgerow so thoroughly concealed that his own divisional commander could have walked past without seeing him. Encounters as the very first event of an American advance. A Sherman's coaxial machine gun raking a long burst across his position with no patrol, no scout, no spotter, and no confirmed sighting preceding it. The tank did not pause to determine whether he was there. It treated the hedge as occupied by default and fired on that assumption. This is the puzzle recorded from inside the German foxhole. The soldier dies. His comrades interrogated afterward describe their confusion in terms that translate consistently as "we cannot understand how he was found." In the German theoretical model of how a man dies in combat, identification necessarily precedes death. The American theory had simply removed that step from the sequence. The rifle squad's volume of fire was only the leading edge of the problem. The deeper mechanism operated above the level of any individual weapon at the gun line. 15 years before Normandy, two field artillery officers at Fort Sill, Major Carlos Brewer and Major Orlando Ward, had built a fire direction system on a proposition that the rest of the artillery world treated with polite skepticism, that a single coordinating center could compute firing solutions for every battery within range, simultaneously allowing a single forward observer to call in the concentrated fire of an entire division's artillery onto one grid square. The demonstration at Fort Sill in 1931 was met by most accounts with something close to institutional indifference. The communications requirements seemed impractical for the radio equipment then available. And the underlying mathematics, however elegant, struck many career artillery officers as a solution to a problem nobody had asked them to solve. Brewer died before the war began, having never seen what his concept would do in combat. The Americans called the resulting capability time on target. In practice, it meant that an American platoon leader looking at a hedgerow he could not see into could transmit a 6-digit map coordinate and have, within 5 to 7 minutes, between 100 and 300 shells from 105mm and 155mm howitzers detonating inside that grid square. German artillery doctrine, by comparison, required pre-plotted survey positions and deliberate calculation. An unexpected threat from an unanticipated direction could take 10 to 15 minutes before German guns could respond at all. And that response still required the kind of direct observation the German system had been built around. At Hill 192 outside St. Lo, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division fired as many as 20 time-on-target missions per night against a sector barely 2 miles wide to keep the paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division continuously off balance. The sustained tempo denied defenders the kind of pattern recognition experience infantry normally develop under bombardment. The learned sense of when a barrage is likely to lift, when movement becomes survivable, when a position can be reoccupied. Aerial photographs of the position afterwards showed terrain that observers described as resembling a moth-eaten blanket, hedgerows and tree lines pockmarked and consumed by repeated saturation fire. The German paratroopers in their Splitter-Tarnanzug smocks were no less concealed on July 10th than they had been on July 1st. Their concealment had simply become irrelevant because it was a property of their individual bodies, and the shells were not aimed at bodies. They were aimed at the grid square the bodies happened to occupy. When the Americans took Hill 192 on July 11, 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division had lost 594 killed and roughly 3,000 wounded across the fighting for that single position. The German defenders had been effectively wiped out, their bodies found afterwards still in their excellent camouflage, killed by an enemy that in many documented cases had never visually located them at all. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, writing to the German High Command before he was wounded by Allied air attack in July, identified the actual cause with the precision of a professional who understood exactly what was killing his men. Their great superiority in artillery, he wrote, and an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. Rommel, among the most respected practitioners of mobile warfare in the entire German officer corps, was not describing better marksmanship or even better camouflage from the American side. He was describing a system and noting that the German army had no comparable answer to it. In December 1944, after the opening of the German Ardennes offensive, General Eisenhower made a request that had been sitting unresolved on his desk for nearly 2 years. Lift the restriction on ground use of the VT fuse, the proximity-fused artillery shell that had been reserved almost exclusively for anti-aircraft applications, out of fear that an unexploded round might fall into enemy hands and be reverse-engineered. The fuse had been developed by Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, a program that had consumed roughly 3% of all American physicists working during the war, and that the Navy had guarded with a secrecy comparable to the atomic bomb project, restricting its use over land for 2 and 1-2 years specifically because the operational value of surprise was judged to outweigh the tactical benefit of earlier deployment. By December 1944, with German ground forces no longer in a position to meaningfully exploit captured technology before the war's end, that calculation changed. Authorization came back within 48 hours of Eisenhower's request. By the end of the month, hundreds of thousands of VT-fused rounds were being fed into American howitzers across the front. The fuse was a miniature radio transmitter built into the shell's nose, broadcasting continuously as the round flew. When the reflected signal indicated the shell had reached an optimal height above the ground, typically 30 to 50 ft, the fuse detonated automatically, producing a precisely timed airburst that sent fragments raining downward over the entire target area, rather than concentrating blast and fragmentation at the point of ground impact. The engineering required to make this reliable was substantial. The electronics inside the shell had to survive being fired from a cannon, an acceleration force exceeding 20,000 times gravity, while spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute. A problem that German ordnance engineers had separately investigated earlier in the war and concluded was not solvable with available vacuum tube technology. They were, on the specific engineering question, wrong. But their assessment was not unreasonable given what German laboratories had managed to test, and it meant German forces went into the last winter of the war with no defensive countermeasure for a weapon their own technical establishment had concluded should not exist. This mattered specifically and devastatingly for camouflage doctrine, because the VT fuse did not care about the kind of cover a concealed rifleman instinctively relied on. A man flat against the earth, hidden in brush or a shallow foxhole, had been protected since 1914 by a simple geometric fact. Fragments from a ground impact shell travel outward and upward, often passing harmlessly over a prone body. The VT fuse inverted that geometry entirely. The detonation happened above the man, and the fragments came down onto him from directly overhead. No posture, no hedgerow, no degree of concealment changed the physics. The chief ordnance officer of the European theater reported that one German patrol caught in the Hürken forest by a barrage using the new fuses was found afterward, with 96 bodies in a condition observers described, without exaggeration, as having gone through a meat grinder. Every one of them still in concealed positions, still camouflaged, none of it having mattered in the slightest. General George Patton, in a memorandum written shortly after the fuse's introduction to ground combat, stated his assessment without qualification. The VT fuse, he wrote, had won the Battle of the Bulge, and once every army possessed the technology, existing infantry tactics built around taking cover from artillery would need to be entirely reinvented. Patton was not a man given to crediting equipment over soldiers as a rule. The specific exception he made for this fuse reflects how completely it had altered the basic calculus of survival under bombardment. Layer this on top of the Garan's rate of fire, reconnaissance by fire, time on target, and forward observers trained down to platoon level, and the German rifleman in his chic design smock. The technical culmination of 15 years of camouflage research was facing an army whose theory of finding him did not require finding him at all. It required only knowing with reasonable confidence that he was somewhere within a defined area, and then delivering enough fire into that area that the distinction stopped mattering. The German confusion recorded in interrogation transcripts borders on philosophical. These were not unintelligent men. They were veterans who understood, in the specific way experienced soldiers understand their own survival, what should and should not get them killed. Their training held that detection preceded to death as an absolute rule. When they could not be detected by every rule they had been taught, they should not have died. The Army's own wartime compilation of German prisoner statements, filed as a classified appendix to the broader combat lessons series and only declassified decades later, contains a section heading that intelligence officers had titled, without apparent irony, Enemy Comments on American Methods. The entries beneath it, drawn from interrogations conducted at division and corps level throughout 1944, are notable less for their content than for how rarely they vary across units that had no contact with each other and no shared chain of command through which a complaint could have spread. The same 4 words recur, translated slightly differently by different interrogators, in entry after entry. We could not locate them. What the Germans could not produce, structurally, rather than through any individual failure, was the combination that the Americans had assembled. They had artillery. They had machine guns. They had time-fused airbursts of their own design. What they did not have was all of it integrated down to the level of a single platoon leader's radio handset, a capability the American Army had spent 15 years quietly building during a period when most of the world, including much of America's own military establishment, considered artillery coordination and infantry rifle volume to be settled. Secondary questions not worth further investment. American camouflage doctrine, for what it is worth, barely existed by comparison. And what little there was frequently backfired. American troops issued the M1942 herringbone twill camouflage pattern were repeatedly mistaken at a distance for Waffen-SS troops and fired on by their own side, leading to the pattern's informal abandonment in the European theater within weeks of its introduction. This was not American superiority in the same discipline the Germans had mastered. It was a different discipline entirely, one that had concluded concealment was a problem worth solving only on the enemy's side of the equation. Here is the forensic verdict. The German rifleman in the hedgerow did not fail. His camouflage did not fail. His training did not fail. What failed was the underlying theory of warfare he had been raised inside, a theory in which visibility was the precondition for lethality, shared symmetrically by both the German army that perfected concealment and the British army that suffered most from it. Both sides in the bocage fighting against each other were playing the same game by the same rules. The British lost repeatedly to a German opponent who was, within that shared framework, simply better. The American army was not better at that same game. It had stopped playing it. Its doctrine treated the location of the enemy, which patch of terrain, not which specific man, as the operational question. And once a patch of terrain was identified as plausible, the rest was procedure. Comb it with machine gun fire, drop mortars on it, call time on target, drive a Sherman through it. A man could be wearing the most sophisticated dappled foliage pattern Otto Schick had ever designed, and it would not matter, because that pattern was a property of the man, and the American response was directed at the ground he occupied rather than at him specifically. This was not American tactical genius in the sense the war's popular mythology often assumes. It was the accumulated output of three separate, unglamorous institutional investments made over 15 years. The Fort Sill Fire Direction Center, the Garand-equipped rifle squad, and Section T's proximity fuse. Three programs that arrived in the same Normandy hedgerow within weeks of one another, more by coincidence of timing than by design. None of the three institutions building them set out to solve the camouflage problem specifically. Camouflage was never the target. It simply stopped mattering as a side effect. Individually, the Germans had rough equivalents to most of these pieces. The Wehrmacht's artillery doctrine was, by most professional assessments, technically excellent within its own terms. German infantry tactics emphasized initiative and aggression in ways American doctrine sometimes envied. What the Germans never built was the integration, the combination running in practice all the way down to a single forward observer's field radio available to a lieutenant rather than reserved for a corps commander's planning staff. The institutional reasons for that gap are worth stating plainly because they explain something beyond this single campaign. German military culture, for all its tactical sophistication, organized itself around the principle that the individual unit commander's judgment and initiative were the primary instruments of combat effectiveness, a principle called Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics that produced extraordinary small unit leadership throughout the war. American doctrine, by contrast, increasingly treated the individual soldier and his immediate commander as nodes in a larger coordinated system, with judgment exercised less at the point of contact and more in the design of the system itself, well before any specific engagement occurred. Both approaches produced excellent soldiers. Only one of them produced an artillery network that could respond to an unconfirmed threat in 5 minutes, regardless of which lieutenant happened to be holding the radio that day. Otto Schick, the Munich art professor whose camouflage research had produced the most advanced individual soldier concealment system of the war, survived the conflict and continued working in textile design afterward. His patterns in modified forms would influence camouflage development for decades, including post-war German Bundeswehr designs and elements of camouflage doctrine adopted by other NATO militaries once the war's lessons had been fully absorbed. The irony embedded in that legacy is specific. The patterns that failed to save the men wearing them against American fire discipline in 1944 were judged correctly to remain excellent against the kind of warfare most armies expected to fight after 1945. Warfare in which visual detection by an opposing soldier, rather than saturation bombardment of a suspected grid square, remained the dominant threat. Schick's camouflage was not a failed technology. It was a brilliant solution to a problem the U.S. Army in Normandy had simply declined to pose. The paratrooper in the hedgerow east of Saint-Lô was the technical inheritor of a camouflage tradition that began with a splitter-tarn pattern of 1931 and the SS field trials of 1937. By any neutral measurement, he was nearly impossible to see. The mortar that killed him did not need to see him. It needed only a grid coordinate that probably contained a hedge that probably contained someone, and a willingness to saturate that coordinate regardless of whether the someone had ever been confirmed. He died without understanding what had killed him because the framework he had trained inside did not contain the possibility of dying unseen. The German theory of combat was deterministic. If undetected, then unharmed. The American theory was probabilistic. Detection was never guaranteed, so the system was built to make that uncertainty survivable through sufficient density of fire. Both theories were internally coherent. Only one of them matched the conditions actually present in the Bocage in the summer of 1944. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden mechanics of the battlefield, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history that was buried under the weight of doctrine and fire. Help us plant the seeds for future discoveries. The next vault of history will open soon.